Kent's been keeping honeybees for more than 30 years. He has several hundred hives both in Western Kentucky and in Mississippi. Kent raises queens, he makes nukes, shakes packages, and he also rents bees for pollination in California and Kentucky and Indiana. And one thing, in addition to speaking to a lot of honeybee groups, Kent also sponsors an annual school for beekeepers at his Kentucky farm in April. So, Kent, we're looking forward to your discussion today, recovering from winter losses.
Okay. Well,
Ken, you may want to share your screen.
how do I do that?
There you go.
You did it.
You're there.
Okay. Good deal. If you keep bees, you're going to have some winter losses. I mean, that's just a given. Every group I speak to, there's always somebody that says, well, my bees don't die. I don't lose bees. And I'm more than happy for you. If you don't lose any hives, then I'm really happy for you. But that's just not me. I lose bees, and I have to have some sort of strategy to get back to the numbers that I want every year. Some years I don't lose that big a percentage, but then some years the percentage is bigger. And the way that we recover our losses most years is by splitting the bees that we still have that are alive. And that's a really good way to recover your losses, but it does require skill set. You have to know how to make nukes, or you have to know how to split a hive. That's a pretty easy learning curve to learn how to split a hive. And don't be afraid to, I joke with groups that don't be afraid to do something that, afraid that you're going to kill the hive because they're going to die anyway. So, I mean, that's just one kind of lighthearted way of looking at it. But seriously, don't be intimidated. If you've never split a hive or you never made a nuke, believe me, you can do it. In April, pretty much everything works that you want to do with bees, because the bees will fix whatever mistakes you make. So
that the people are not shown at the top.
You can come back from losses, and the losses that you guys have had at your two apiaries at Ellington and the other one, they're typical, actually. From what I've heard other people talking about this year, it looks like there's going to be somewhere between a 30 and a 60% loss, just kind of across the board in our region. Now, that's pretty wide variance, but our region is pretty it's pretty widely varied in the microclimates and foraging and fall forage. So it's not unusual to have a pretty wide variation there. But the losses that you guys have had are relatively easy to come back from, because you can split what you've got. If you can keep the bees alive, or that you're still at 50% or better that are alive going into the spring, it's pretty easy to come back from, because you split, just make an even split. And that does two things. Number one, it gets you back to your numbers, plus you're probably not going to have any swarming issues out of the hives that are split, because you have allowed the bees to accomplish what nature tells them they need to be doing at that time of year. You can either split your bees or they'll split themselves. A healthy colony is going to divide itself sometime during the spring. Usually when spring forage comes out, as soon as the honey flow starts, a healthy hive is going to begin thinking about swarming. That's just natural instinct. It's reproduction at the colony level. Well, when you split the hive, you've allowed them to feel like that they have accomplished what nature tells them they need to accomplish, which is reproducing the colony. So it goes a long way toward reducing the number of swarms you'll have, which will also go a long way towards giving you a better honey crop overall than you would have had if several hives swarm. You'll have two big hives that don't swarm, they make the bulk of your honey, and the other half a dozen hives swarm and they don't make much at all. So if you split them all and wind up with 8, 10 average hives going into a honey flow, your overall crop will probably be better. Plus, you've got back to the numbers that you want. And that's the way that we handle winter losses. Sometimes we will even purchase bees coming back out of almonds and make up nukes or shake packages out of those purchased bees, and we use some of those to make up our winter losses as well. But that's not every year, but that's actually a decent business model to do that if you have the wherewithal to do it. If you have contacts in California, if you're not afraid to bite the bullet and go ahead and do that, that's a legitimate way of not only coming back from losses, but making up nukes, making up singles to sell people, and you wind up not being out any money for what bees you keep, because it's kind of a wash after you sell what you don't need. And that's another way that we come back from losses. But I realize that everybody don't have that same ability to do it. They just don't have the opportunity. It's not that you can't, it's just you don't have that opportunity. So to start with, there's 3 ways of making up losses. One, and the least dependable way, is catching swarms to make up your losses. If you only have a few hives, you might think, well, I can catch swarms and make up losses, what I've lost by catching swarms. Well, you're depending on there actually being a lot of swarms in that particular year, or being notified that there's a swarm that you can catch, people calling you. That's one downfall to it. The other is there's a big variation in size of swarms, the health of swarms, what they've got going on genetically speaking. And if you continue catching swarms and building your bee business from swarmed bees, eventually the bees that you have will be a little bit more swarmy, just because that it's a genetic predisposition. And the third downfall to depending on catching swarms is that they're not always located somewhere that's easy to get to. A swarm 40 feet up in a tree, I never have been willing to pay an emergency room bill in order to catch a swarm. And that's probably what would happen if I tried to go 40 foot up into a tree, even when I was younger. But they're not always where they're easy to catch. So there's some downfalls to depending on catching swarms. With that being said, yeah, you can make up your losses by doing that. Some years, last year was that, man, it was swarms on top of swarms, and not just around here, but everybody I talked to in the Midwest and Mid-South had a huge swarm season. And this year it may not be. It may be no swarms at all. I have seen years where there are just very few swarms, but that is one way of making up losses. Another way is what I've already mentioned, making your own splits from your own bees. And if you decide to make splits or to make nukes, you'll be more successful if you use a mated queen to make the split or the nuke. You can make a walkaway split, or you can use a queen cell to make splits or make nukes, and that works. But there's a big but in there. You're going to be immediately 2.5 to 3 weeks behind the timeline for how that hive is going to recover, or how that hive is going to take off. just because you're starting with a mated queen, which is going to begin producing brood within 3 or 4 days, versus the hive having to make a queen or allow a queen to fly out and be mated and come back and take over the hive, queen wise. So you're behind, but it's not that it won't work. It's just that it's like the old saying, you got to make hay while the sun shines. In the spring, when the bees are wanting to just go crazy raising brood, you need a queen in there that's laying eggs. And at some point, you'll realize that any queen is better than no queen. In some circumstances, you can eventually come around to getting a better queen eventually. But if you use a mated queen to make your splits with, you will, or either your splits or your nukes, is basically the same mechanics in doing either one. But if you use a mated queen, you're ahead of the curve time-wise. So I would recommend using a mated queen. If you can't get a mated queen, they'll raise their own. In April, April and May, early June, if you have a hive that doesn't have a queen and they have the material, meaning larva 3 days old or less, to make a queen, they'll make a queen. They'll raise a queen. About a third of the time, a virgin never comes back from a mating flight. So kind of factor that in. If you have 9 hives and you make a walkaway split with all of them wanting to get to 18 hives, more than likely 2 or 3 of those are not going to come back. The queen's not going to come back. So just get mentally prepared for that and have a plan of what you're going to do when they don't come back. If you make a walkaway split, or if you start with a queen cell in a split or in a nuke, and that virgin don't come back, you're kind of under the gun then, time wise, for the bees to make a queen. Even if you put a frame of young brood in there, by the time a queen gets back to the hive and starts laying eggs and actually produces adult bees, the hive may be dead just because of attrition, just because of the life cycle of the honeybees in the spring when they're flying like mad. So if that walkaway split doesn't work, or if your queen cell, if the virgin don't come back from a mating flight, you really need to think about putting a mated queen in there at that point, just so that the hive won't die from attrition from losing old bees before they have replacements coming up, through the pipeline. So that's a thought that when I first started keeping bees and doing things like this, that just escaped me. I thought that, well, I can just put another frame of eggs in there and they'll make a queen. Well, they did, and once in a while it worked. But more often than not, the hive would either I'd be nursing it all summer long, because the population was so low and they couldn't take care of the brood that was in there. And it would just touch and go whether or not the thing was going to have enough bees going into winter to survive the winter. And a lot of times they didn't. But you learn from your mistakes, hopefully, if you're not insane. And that's kind of questionable sometimes with me too, but you should learn from your mistakes. And I realized finally that if the walkaway don't work the first time, use a mated queen and save the hive. Let the hive come back. Yep.
We have a question by someone that's what is a walkaway split?
A walkaway split is when you're not even looking for the queen. You don't care what side the queen's in. You have, for instance, let's say you have 2 deep hive bodies and both of them have a lot of bees in them, and you just divide those hive bodies and set one off on its own bottom board and make sure that both hive bodies have bees, food, and larvae or eggs in them. If both hive bodies have that in them, It doesn't matter which one has a queen, the one that does not have a queen will make a queen. And the reason it's called a walkaway split is because you just divide the hive, set it on its own bottom board, put a top on it, and walk away. And that's actually not a bad way to increase your number of bees. On the other hand, about a third of the time, you're going to be forced to put a mated queen, either that or rejoin it with its original hive. You can do that too. But I've always been hard-headed, and if it didn't work the first time, I'd get a bigger hammer, and I'd make it work the next time. So I would always opt for just getting a mated queen and putting in there rather than joining it back to its original hive. So that's a walkaway split. Walkaway splits are super easy, and it's an excellent way to kind of get in at the ground floor of raising your own queens, because that's what you're doing. The bees are doing the work, but you're providing the input, that you're providing the stimulation that stimulates their natural instinct to raise a queen. So that's a good ground floor method of raising your own queens and promoting your own genetics, which is not a bad thing. And I'll guarantee you that the queen that you raise will be better than one you can buy. I don't care who you're buying it from. The reason for that is your virgin queens are going to be competing for a lot better stocked drone pool. They're not going to be one of 10,000 hives trying to find drones. You're going to be one hive, maybe at the most out of 100 in your area, that have queens that are flying to be mated. Your queens will be better mated than most commercial queens could possibly be mated, just because of competition. So that's a walkaway split. Queen cells, anybody that's raising queen cells or raising queens, most of the time has extra queen cells, and they're a lot cheaper than a mated queen. They're not quite as dependable as a mated queen, just because there's things that can go wrong with a queen cell that the mated queen has already got past that issue. So those are ways that you can make your own splits, and you kind of know what you've got that way. As long as your losses are under 50%, or 40 to 50%, making your own splits, you're not really going to miss much of a honey crop by doing that, just because you're going to relieve the swarming impulse by making the splits, and all of your hives are likely to make a better average crop than you would if a decent number of them swarmed and took most of the young population away and kind of put everything behind an 8-ball in that hive that swarmed. But you'll make a decent honey crop, and you won't have that many swarms, and you'll get back to the numbers that you had in mind to go through the year with. So those are the pitches for making your own splits. Now, if your losses are more than 50%, which some years they will be, it's beekeeping, it's nature, and it's what we have to deal with in beekeeping today. And some years you might have a 70 or 80% loss or higher. In those years, your choices become more limited as far as how you're going to come back from those numbers if you're wanting to make a honey crop. If you're willing to give up making your honey crop, you can come back from a 90% loss just by making splits, breaking the hives that you have down into nukes, growing the nukes out, and then breaking all those down into nukes, or making direct splits out of them. And you can come back from major losses that way, but you can't make a honey crop coming back from big losses in that way. Now, if your losses are somewhere, but 75%, you can gain numbers by making 3-frame nukes and letting those grow out and leaving some of your hives, some of your bigger hives that can make a honey crop, but just taking a few frames of bees out of them. And that also will help with the swarming impulse with those bigger hives. Plus it will get you a few nukes that you can grow out over the summer and go into the fall with the right number of bees that everybody's got in somewhere in their mind what number of hives that they would like to have. And that will get you to where you need to be by doing that. But you won't make as big a honey crop. You might make some. It's always a trade-off between making bees or making honey. And anything that you do with bees, if you're going to be successful at it, it takes a big hive of bees. It takes a big hive of bees to make a big crop of honey. It takes a big hive of bees to make money at selling nukes or selling packages or raising queens. So you're going to have your bees, you're going to be breaking your bees down all summer long if you have huge losses. But there again, you're giving up the one thing in order to get your numbers back for the next fall. And until they won the World Series a few years ago, I used to joke that it was like beekeeping was like being a Chicago Cubs fan. He's always playing for next year. And it seems like everything that we do, we're doing it with our mind looking to the following year. And that's kind of what it is when you're making up big losses like that. Now, the third way of making up losses is to purchase bees. And if you have a big market for your honey, so that you actually need a good honey crop every year because you've got stores that depend on it, or you have a lot of customers that depend on your honey. And if you have a good market for your honey, then purchasing bees is actually a pretty good business plan for making up losses, because it's not going to knock your population down in your hives if you've got major losses. If you still have just 40% losses, 40 to 50% losses, you don't have to buy bees. You can make it up using your own bees. But if it's over 50%, that's when you kind of start thinking, maybe I should buy some nukes, or maybe I should go in a different direction and buy bees in some form or another. Just because, and it's all about following the money, really. Just because you have honey customers that you need to service that customer base, or you might lose it. So if you don't have honey, somebody else will. And if your customers buy their honey, they may be more loyal to the other label as opposed to yours. So that's the only reason to think about purchasing bees if you're wanting to grow a lot fast and still make a big honey crop, or if your losses are really substantial and you need that honey crop to satisfy your customer base. Those are the only reasons. Now, the post of all of this is figure out why you lost them and try not to repeat that. I won't say mistake or failure, just because that's too depressing, but figure out why you lost them and try not to repeat that lack of success that you had keeping them alive. We had a fairly significant loss in our bees this year going into winter. And significant for us. We're used to having somewhere between 8 to 10% loss on average throughout the year. And this year it was higher than that. It was up close to 40% of loss. And interesting enough, our bees look great, but all of a sudden hives began to go empty. And it was kind of, I guess, providential in a way that we had just had our state apiarists down here checking bees and taking samples to send to the Bee Informed Partnership people. They do that every year with our bees because our bees move all over the country, and we're a good target to see what's going on with bees that move to multiple states during the year. And we had almost no varroa mites. 4 varroa mites out of 833 bees. We had no nosema. We had no acute paralysis, Israeli acute paralysis, none of that virus, no deformed wing virus. But we had 65% infection rate of Lake Sinai virus. So, the Lake Sinai virus does not have any visible symptoms. So there was no way that anybody could have looked at a hive and said, yep, they're going to die. They've got Lake Sinai virus. They had to go to Beltsville, Maryland that's where Bee Informed Partnership does their analysis. And I would have never known what the symptom was, but there's several things that mimic that same symptom. The symptom of Lake Sinai virus is that the hives just dwindle in strength until there's no bees left in them. And you don't know whether it's that or whether it's something else going on until you have them checked. So, that, and there's nothing that you can do about it. So the only thing that can be done is make sure your varroa count stays as low as possible all year long, and never let varroa get ahead of you. So that's our story this year. We've got to make up some losses, but we'll make them up by splitting our own bees. And we can split our bees a lot earlier in South Mississippi than we can here. And it makes it a little bit better for us. On the other hand, it is 500 miles away. So it's not like going out into the back field and doing it. And if you Google that, it's Lake Sinai virus, and it's named after Lake Sinai in South Dakota, which is where it was first detected. And it's a pretty devastating thing when you get it, and once you get it, it's just a matter of time until that hive goes empty, because Lake Sinai spreads. The literature says that it spreads horizontally and vertically, which means it spreads from adult bee to adult bee. And it also spreads once the queen becomes infected, and she will eventually. Every egg that she lays will have it. So it spreads in a generational way through reproduction, just like it does from feeding one bee to another. So it's it's hard to get around something like that. So you have to figure out what you're going to do to get back to your numbers. And what we're going to do is split all of our bees. And we probably won't be able to raise quite as many queens early for sale this year as we normally do, because we'll be using all of them ourselves. And that's just beekeeping. And I felt pretty much like a clod from having a pretty significant loss for us, till I started talking to some other beekeepers the same size that we were, and smaller too. But seemed like everybody lost some bees a lot. Some people lost a lot of bees. So I began feeling a little bit less ignorant, but it doesn't matter. It's a small consolation knowing that you still got to make up 40% of your bees. So those are the methods that that we use to make up our winter losses. But really, the main thing is finding out how come you lost them. If they starved out because they couldn't get to food, then figure out a way to correct that. There's not a good way to correct what we're going to be experiencing in the next couple of days. below zero wind chills. About the only way to correct that would be to either put them in a building or take them south. And that's not, neither one of those are options that everybody can do. In fact, not many people can do those, either one of them. So wrapping the bees, good idea. Try to put a windbreak in front of the hive where the wind won't sweep by the entrance and suck out some of the warmth. If you have a bottom screen, make sure air can't flow side to side or front to back under the hive, so it's not pulling heat out of the hive when it goes past the bottom screen. Also, make sure your bees have upper ventilation, or at least ventilation. Snow is okay. You can have snow completely covering hives and it's okay. But if it ices over, the hive will smother. Bees can pull air through snow. They can't pull air through ice. So if we have an ice covering, take a hive tool or something and chip the ice away from the front entrance. Or it's okay. You don't have to brush the snow away from it. You can if you want to, but as long as it's not iced over, you're okay. Or as long as you have a bottom screen, those are fine. They're not likely to get iced up. If you have a top ventilation hole or upper ventilation, upper entrance, that's not likely to get iced up. Just make sure that you don't get ice covering on your hive. And if they're wrapped with a windbreak, that's about the best you can do. Make sure you have feed on them, which everybody should have already done. But if you guys are like me, your should haves are not always sufficient, because I should have done some things, but it just didn't happen. But our issues started last year with Lake Sinai. Our issues started when the mid-season mite control that we used didn't give us a good kill on varroa mites. And we didn't have huge numbers of mites when we went back and did a mite wash to check and see, how effective our treatment was. We didn't have huge numbers of mites, but we had more than what we normally have. And we came back and used a second treatment. With the second treatment we used was formic acid. And the formic acid really knocked the mites down really, really well. And probably should have used that first. So I wouldn't have even been inclined to check the hives, except I had two other beekeepers in the Paducah area that I checked their bees, and they had used the same treatment that I had, and they had gobs of mites in their hives still. And I thought, well, that don't sound too good. Maybe I should check mine, make sure that it worked. And I checked them and it worked, but not good enough. So that's where we kind of got behind with our mite control. And I don't know if mites were developing a tolerance. What we used was apivar strips. I don't know if they were developing a tolerance, if the strips weren't as strong as they could have been, if they could have been outdated. I'm not really sure. Whatever the reason was, we didn't get as good of a kill as we would have liked. And we cleaned it up with formic acid. And Lake Sinai virus, it is transmitted into the hive by varroa mites. That's how it first gets into the hive. And after it gets into the hive, even if just a few bees are infected with it, eventually enough bees will become infected with it just from sharing food one to another. Enough bees will become infected with it that eventually the queen will become infected with it. And that's when the problems really start. As long as it's just adult bees that are having it, your hive won't crash. But when the queens become infected, you have about somewhere around 4 weeks, 5 weeks before a hive will crash at that point. and there won't be a lot of stuff that you can investigate in there, because there just won't be that many bees. There won't be any dead bees. There might be a handful of live bees. Queen might still be in there, but the bees leave the hive and just don't come back. And it's not exactly like CCD used to be, but because other bees will rob the honey out of the hive. But it does kind of remind you of some of the symptoms that were associated with colony collapse. And I'm not saying that Lake Sinai was associated with colony collapse. They just share some of the same symptoms. So if you can stay ahead of varroa mites, you'll probably will stay ahead of things like Lake Sinai. And that's best advice that I can give. And wrap your bees up and cross your fingers. Hope we get snow and not ice. Anybody have any questions that Al can answer?
That isn't the way that works, Kent. It's I ask them, then you answer them.
I misunderstood that.
No, you misunderstood that. One of the questions says that swarming sometimes occurs even after the split. Do you have any extra steps to prevent swarming, like checkerboarding or empty frames?
Once a hive has committed itself to swarming, there's nothing that you can do to keep a certain number of those bees from swarming. Now, I like to give people an example of a long time ago when I first started keeping bees. About the third or fourth year I had bees, I was working through a hive and they decided they were going to swarm. And it was really awesome. It was amazing watching how a hive acts inside a hive when you've got the top off of it, looking at the way they're interacting with one another and running across the frames, just acting crazy, and while they're swarming. And I thought, I can fix this. Because one of those famous last words kind of things. I had a bunch of nuke boxes sitting right there in that bee yard. So I took frames. I found queen cells that were on frames. I put a queen cell and a frame of brood in several different nuke boxes. I used 2 frames of bees in each nuke box, and I had 8 nukes made up out there. And I thought, well, I've fixed your wagon. So I was so proud of myself. I came back to the house and decided I was probably about the smartest beekeeper anywhere around Cuba, Kentucky, and which wouldn't have been hard because I was about it. But I went out there the next day expecting to see all these hives just in, perfect harmony with one another. And instead of 8 swarms, I found 9 swarms in that bee yard hanging on little bushes. All of them were about the size of a baseball. So I realized then that once nature decides to do something, you might as well give up. You're not going to thwart nature. So when you make a split, and I did this last year. I had a bunch of bees that came back from almonds, and I made a lot of splits, made up a lot of nukes with them. Some of them had already decided to swarm when I made the nuke up. They weren't in the swarm mode like the one that I was talking about, that acting crazy on the frames and running like a riot in the hive. They weren't doing that, but they had already, their impulse had been triggered. And I made up nukes out of, I think it was 220 double hives. I made up a bunch of nukes, and a lot of them swarmed out of a nuke box when I had 3 frames of bees in it and 2 frames of drawn comb. And a lot of them swarmed. And I'd say out of what I made up around 410 nukes. And out of those 410, I would guess about 40 of them swarm. So you're just not going to, once that trigger has been pulled, you're just not going to be able to stop them from swarming. And how do you know that it's already started? The best indication is that it could have already been triggered. If there's a capped queen cell in the hive, it could be triggered. If there's an uncapped cell, they're not there yet. But if there's a capped queen cell in there, they could have already swarmed, or they could already be, they have already decided to swarm and you're not going to change their mind about it. So that's the dynamics behind trying to deal with swarming in the spring, because once they decide to, that's what's going to happen. You just have to deal with it. And we caught a bunch of swarms last year. I think we caught more swarms on our farm last year than I ever have in the years I've been beekeeping. But the good part of it was that we'd catch a swarm, we'd put it in a nuke box with some with some drawn comb, and most of them stayed. And they made nukes that it's almost like that they were like, you think you know how to split a hive? We'll show you how to split a hive.
Now,
And
to ask him
so
about his.
that's just what you have to deal with when you live on my farm anyway.
Might want to go up there, period. Thanks.
Any other questions, Al?
It says, if you have a hive loss, can you send your bees to the Bee Informed Partnership to determine what happened?
You can't unless you're signed up with them. You can get signed up with them if you want to. Talk to your state apiarist or somebody in the extension service. You can get signed up with them, but you can send your bees to Beltsville just by yourself, and they'll treat you just like that you're a university professor. I've sent bees to Beltsville before, just mailed them, shipped them. But if you send them to Beltsville, send them the same way that they send them with a Bee Informed Partnership. What they do, they take a representative sample out of 8 different hives, and they take pollen from those hives. They take a sampling of live bees off of a frame of larvae, off a frame of unsealed brood. They take a sampling of live bees and they split the sample in 2. One of them they freeze, the other they put in alcohol. And if you ship that to Beltsville, then you'll get the same treatment as Bee Informed does. If you can't get involved in, and there's other outfits like Bee Informed Partnership that do the same thing. Just get with your UT extension people, and I mean Jennifer Saruta, she'd probably be able to help you figure out what outfit to get hooked up with, or she could send them. She could even send them herself. Just make sure they get there. Check up on them.
When would you actually start making the splits in the spring?
Start making the splits as soon as you see mature drones, because when you start seeing mature drones, that means that the bees are ready to make new queens, and they're ready to do splits on their own. You can begin making splits when you start seeing queen cells or queen cups, active queen cups in your hives. Once in a while, you'll get fooled on that, because once in a while, they'll be making one because they lost a queen for some reason. Queens sometimes just croak, I mean, to put it plain. And once in a while, you'll see some queen cells at a time of year when, like in early March in our area. And just a general calendar date would be somewhere between the 4th week of March and the 2nd week of April, depending on the weather of that year. Some years our spring breaks early, and then the 4th week of March. you can start thinking about making splits. But most years it's first, second week of April, most years. And if you do that, you're probably going to need to seriously consider getting a mated queen somewhere until you can raise your own.
Are you familiar with the, I think it's Pagden method of splitting a hive and swarm control?
I'm not familiar with the Pankton method, but there's a lot of methods of splitting hives and swarm control that are all similar methods that have different names. And it's no knock on Pankton or whoever it is that comes up with a different way of doing it, because usually the differences are nuanced. They're not major differences, but I'm not really familiar with it. But one good way of swarm control and also splitting the hive is to use a double screen. And a double screen is more or less the same thing as a walkaway split that's vertical instead of setting it off next to its parent hive. The advantage of using a double screen is that top, you have bees, everything that it takes to make a queen in the bottom, and you have everything it takes to make a queen in the top. Then you have a double screen with an entrance that allows for entry into the top hive. Usually this entrance is going to be opposite to the entrance of the bottom hive, and you set that up, and the advantage of that over just a walkaway split is heat conservation. It's that that top hive benefits from the heat generated from the cluster in the bottom hive. And another advantage is that if one of those queens, whichever hive does not have a queen, they're going to make one. And if that queen does not return, it's a simple thing just to remove the double screen and put it back together. That's excellent swarm control. It's a good way to increase your numbers without really taking that big of a risk. And you don't have to have as much equipment because you don't need a separate bottom board and a separate top for that, for a double screen hive. You can do the same thing as a double screen if you use two queen excluders with a super in between them. And all the queen excluders do is keep the queens from being able to get together with one another, and to stop the transfer of bees from the bottom to the top and vice versa that have queen pheromone. Because if you just have one queen excluder, you're going to have some queen pheromone that could transfer between that excluder, and whichever hive does not have a queen, that would make them less likely to raise a queen if they're getting any transfer through the excluder. So you have two excluders, one on either side of a super, shallow or medium super. And then you have your second box on top. Same thing as a double screened hive, you're just sharing a few bees along with the heat transfer. So I'm not sure about the Pankington method, but those are two ways of doing it that are legitimate. And I didn't mention any names that you would call either one of them, just because there's so many names that they're called by, that everybody has put their own stamp on it. And all of them work, and none of them are just head and shoulders above another method. But I'm sure the Pankington would work. That was the queen excluder thing is called the Doolittle method, one name of it. And it worked for Doolittle 150 years ago, so I'm sure it still works now.
In the winter, Kent says, are you a fan of using sticky bottom boards? This person says, I have heard that keeping the boards out in the winter helps with the chimney effect and keeping the moisture from accumulating, but they're worried that it gets cold.
Well, you don't really have to worry about the cold weather of keeping the board out, as long as you keep the wind from being able to sweep under the hive. If you'll put a windbreak all the way around the hive where wind can't flow under the hive, air can't flow under the hive, and the only air transfer you're getting is vertical, going up into the hive or down out of it. Since cold air sinks anyway and hot air rises, a screen bottom board in theory would allow the cluster to stay a little bit warmer in theory. I'm not sure that works quite that way in reality, but as long as you can keep wind from going under the hive and pulling the heat out, if wind sweeps under that bottom screen, it's going to suck some heat away from that cluster, and that's not a good thing. But if you can block up on either end and both sides of a hive where it's no wind going under it, I don't think it would be a bad thing at all to leave the board out in the winter.
But if they don't have a windbreak, you should want to leave it in, right?
If you don't have a windbreak, and it's simple enough to make a windbreak, take a piece of plywood or something and just set up against it and put a brick against it or something like that. It's easy to make a windbreak under a hive. But if you don't have a windbreak, I'd leave the bottom in, leave that board in.
Another question, would draping the hive with the plastic cover that we use for winter gardening work as a windbreak?
Yeah, it would. It'd work as a windbreak. You don't want to just completely cover the hive with plastic because that'd be like putting your head in a plastic bag, you know. But it would work as a windbreak. You could maybe not maybe not drape the entire hive with it, but just around the bottom. That would work great. That'd be a good windbreak.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions we have, Kent. Buzz?
Wait a minute, let me get my audio on.
One thing before Buzz, also, Kent, you might want to mention about your April beekeepers.
Yeah, we have a beekeepers school in April, and we are having an in-person school here on our farm again this year. We did not have it last year because of obvious reasons, but we are having it this year. It'll be April 15, 16, and 17 from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. lunch served, and it'll be in person. We'll be working through live hives of bees. So bring your suit. You don't have to have a smoker or a hive tool or anything like that. You can bring them if you want to, but you probably won't be using either one. I mean, we'll have plenty of smokers and plenty of people that are opening hives, and most of the focus is on partly what we've been talking about today: how to make more bees, how to increase your numbers of bees. And along with that is raising queens. And we do a lot of queen rearing work, and people come here and learn how to graft and practice it and learn how to set up a cell builder. Now, we also teach how to raise just enough queens to replace the queens that replace your old queens. And you don't have to know how to graft or do anything like that to just make enough queens to replace what you have for hives, have in your hives. We also teach small scale and backyard queen rearing as well. Simple stuff that really don't take much of a skill set. And you'll be surprised if you do practice grafting. You'll be surprised how little of a skill set that takes. It's mostly just a very small amount of mechanics and having the initiative to try it mostly. But those are usually the focuses. And we have a lot of fun stuff also. So it don't cost anything. We do take donations to help cover the cost of the food every day. But if you come and eat a great big bunch of food and don't leave a donation, you can come back the next day and do the same thing. We won't run you off at the gate. So we don't care if we go in the hole or not. We're not doing it to make money. We don't take pre-registration, just show up.
Kent,
Yeah.
thank you. We recorded this so we can go back and look at it. And what is the address of the school? If we wanted to get up there, where is it?
You can't get here from there. No, the address is 580 State Route 385 North.
All right, if we were gonna stay overnight, where would we stay?
Mayfield, Kentucky is the nearest. That's the nearest motels. It's about 15 miles from here.
Okay,
Murray, Kentucky has a better selection of motels. College Town, they have better facilities. It's 25 miles from here, but both of them are an easy drive. The town, it's 580 State Route 385 North. The town is Wingo, Kentucky. Wingo.
and what time does it start?
9 a.m.
Okay.
There's no such thing as being too early or too late. There's people. It's very informal. People come and go throughout the day, every day, and it's not very structured. We just do what we want to do when we want to do it throughout all 3 days. And if you come and we're not doing anything that you're interested in, tell us what you're interested in. We'll do it, as long as it's not like setting fire to a hive or something.
Okay, all right. Any other questions before we sign off? I'd like to remind you that our next meeting is the 14th of March, and our speaker is Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell University. He wrote Honeybee Democracy. We're really excited to have a Zoom meeting with Dr. Seeley. His topic is going to be the bee colony as a honey factory. And that should be very interesting. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you again, Kent, Al, everyone. We're done.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Buzz.
Kent.
Thank you, Kent. Great job.